leadership and service doesn't always do general topic presentations like the one tonight. We tend to focus a lot on vocation and career and purpose and meaning, but this is kind of a bit of a test run for us to something that we're calling our Lead Through series. So how we lead through things that are deeply important to our life together, our civic life, our life here as a campus community, and we thought that this was a great topic to kick things off. On the back of your programs, you will find other things that are happening at the Institute in the month of November. If you have questions about any of those things, you can find myself or my colleague, Allie DeVries, after the event tonight. But with no further ado, I would like to welcome up here Professor Osama Abdelgawad. He is an assistant professor in the theology department, and he is going to introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening, everyone. I was talking to Matt, and I figured out we both are Fulbrighters. So Fulbright is a high quality institution, and it has a very strong community that looks forward to having people who can serve better in terms of the diversity and pluralism and understanding and mutual understanding. And Dr. Matthew Kaemingk is an assistant professor of Christian ethics at Fuller Theological Seminary and associate dean of Fuller, Texas in Houston. Matthew also serves as a fellow at the Center for Public Justice and scholar in residence in the Deep Creek Center of Christian Leadership. Matthew is an ordained minister in the Christian Reformed Church. His research and teaching focus on political ethics and religious pluralism, workplace theology, theology and culture, and Reformed public theology. He learned his Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary and holds a doctoral degree in systematic theology from Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam and in Christian ethics from Fuller Theological Seminary. As a Fulbright scholar in Amsterdam, Matthew studied political theology and European conflict over Muslim immigration. Matthew's new book, that one he's discussing tonight, Christian Hospitality and Muslim Immigration in an Age of Fear, engages the growing conflict over Muslim immigration in both Europe and the United States, critical of both the right-wing nationalism and left-wing multiculturalism. The book explores a uniquely Christian response to the debate and the explosive politics of deep differences. So what is amazing about this book, when I was going through this book and reading, I found that he is trying to provide a practical solution to the American Christian community. How can you help and support your neighbors without compromising your beliefs and faiths? Please welcome Dr. Matthew.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, and thank you so much for having me. I really am honored to be here with you all, and honored to have this conversation on what I feel is an extremely important topic: how we live together amidst deep, deep difference. And this past week, another tragedy reminds us of the urgency of interfaith hospitality. So I'm honored to have this conversation with all of you, and hope to have some good time at the end for conversation. Sorry, I have to take a moment. My high school English teacher, 10th grade, who I haven't seen since 10th grade, I just noticed him in the audience. Mr. Altino, would you stand up?
You're doing great, keep going.
All right. I'm going to watch my grammar. Okay. I All right, Christian hospitality in an age of fear. When talking about Muslim immigration, specifically here in the United States, a core thing in my argument is that we actually need to look at the European experience. The debate over Muslim immigration here in the United States is relatively new. For the most part, it's really been kicked off by President Donald Trump in the last 2 years. But it has been a debate in Europe, a heavy and heated political debate in Europe for 30 years now. And there's much that we can learn from the discourse that has occurred in Europe, from the successes and the failures of the European experience. And so in my book, I explore specifically how this has taken shape in the Netherlands. And in Europe, specifically, there have been two main voices in the political theater on how Europe should respond to Muslim immigrants. Two broad voices that we could simply term open doors and high walls. One voice arguing for wider doors, and one voice for higher walls. You'll notice a lot of similarities, but one of the reasons why I want to focus on Europe is because as Americans, when I start talking about Republicans and Democrats, that gets kind of close to home. If we talk about Europe, it's kind of easier for us to step back. And we can all be critical of Europeans, right? All right, so the open doors voices obviously stress a posture of openness towards Muslim immigrants, a focus on government aid for Muslim immigrants, an importance of political correctness, which is being careful with your language about Muslim immigrants, and a sort of soft assimilation, which would be essentially, let's develop governmental programs to help these Muslim immigrants learn the language, get jobs, grow in education, and hopefully, eventually, they will become more like us. They will become more French. They will become more German. They will become more British. On the other side, the high walls voices argue that this is a security issue. Muslim immigration should be framed as a security issue. And they should be framed primarily as a security threat. There's a strong focus on law and order, a strong emphasis on national culture and national identity, which is a re-exploration of what does it mean to be French, and how do we cultivate Frenchness? Or what does it mean to be German, and how do we cultivate Germanness? How do we induct these people into German culture or British culture? And a focus on hard assimilation, a more aggressive assimilation. But you'll notice that with both of these voices, there is a common assumption that ultimately Islam is framed as a problem to be solved, a question to be answered, a challenge to be overcome. And with each coming year, the debate gets more intense and the debate gets more complex. There are battles over security measures, battles over schooling, battles over clothing. Where can minarets be built? What style should a mosque be built in? Who is allowed to fund these mosques or these Muslim schools? Debates over Muslim marriage and Muslim divorce. The debates seem to proliferate and get more complex and more heated. And both sides struggle to answer these kinds of questions. Now, in this presentation, I want to start to chart a way beyond the politics of walls and doors. And as a Christian theologian and as a Christian ethicist, I believe that we have some resources within our faith to move beyond these categories in some important ways. But before I do that, I need to kind of convince you that walls and doors aren't enough. And to do that, I want to talk you through a little bit of the Dutch experience. So after World War II, the Dutch economy was booming. Factories were opening, shops were opening, and they needed cheap labor. And the Dutch people didn't want to do it. And they didn't want to do this dirty work in the factories, and so they started to invite workers from Morocco and Turkey, North Africa, and the Middle East to come to the Netherlands to serve as gastworkers, guest workers. Okay? So they invited them, they built these apartment tenements outside of their cities where all of the Muslims would live, and they would go into their factories and do their work, but the assumption was always these would be guest workers. Eventually they would go home. As the time went on in the 1960s and 1970s, these guest workers started to bring their families and started to have children. And it began to settle in with the Dutch people that these people are going to stay. So they start to build schools for them and build community centers for them and start to help them grow in the Netherlands. And ultimately, through a lot of very generous government programs, they continue to try to empower these immigrants to grow into their Dutchness. And the thought was always, if we give them enough education, if we help them get jobs, if we turn them into consumers, right, eventually they'll see the beauty of the Dutch way of life and they'll sort of outgrow their Muslimness. If we protect them, like with a sense of political correctness, eventually they will see the light. The problem was that many of them were not seeing the light, the beauty of Dutch life. As wonderful as coffee and stroopwafel and tulips are. I'm a descendant of Dutch immigrants. I have this sort of pride for the Dutch. So during the 1980s, and specifically in the 1990s, there were cracks in this patience that were starting to form. Frustration amongst the Dutch people. They weren't allowed to criticize Islam, which they found to be very backwards and very patriarchal. They were a progressive society who believed in female empowerment, and they saw Islam as hateful towards women and hateful towards homosexuality. They were taking their jobs, and so this sort of bubbling underneath the surface was growing. But no one was allowed to talk about this or process this in any way. And so this hatred starts to build through the 1980s and 1990s. And ever so slightly during the 90s, some cracks begin to form in the Dutch political culture. And people start to give voice to their hatred of these Muslim immigrants. One of these individuals who specifically was a very outspoken provocateur was this man. His name is Theo van Gogh. That name might sound familiar. He's the great-grandnephew of Vincent van Gogh. A provocative artist, media personality, and film director, Theo van Gogh made a sport out of mocking Muslim immigrants in a wide variety of ways and calling them terrible names. But what ultimately was the straw that broke the camel's back was a film. I'm going to stay off of that. It's an upsetting picture. It was a film that Theo van Gogh made with a woman named Ayaan Hirsi Ali that was extremely critical of Islam. It's a short 10-minute film that told the story of 5 Muslim women who share the story of being either beaten, raped, abused, or controlled by Muslim men. Over 11 minutes, they share their story of being abused. And as they share their story, they are crying out to Allah for help. Please help me. Please help me. No one will help me. And there is no answer. And this film was shown all over the Netherlands. And of course, the implicit message is, Allah is not answering these women. Will you answer these women? Will you liberate these poor Muslim women? Will you take up and challenge this? And this film shows very dramatic images of naked Muslim women who are been beaten, and it projects sacred texts of the Quran onto their bodies. You can imagine this had quite a reaction in Dutch society. Soon after this film came out, Theo van Gogh got on his bicycle in Amsterdam in the morning and rode his bicycle down the street. A man named Mohammed Bouyeri came up behind him and shot him off of his bicycle. Theo was able to get up and run across the street to try and get away. But Mohammed chased after him and shot him several more times, stabbed him in the chest about 50 times, and tried to cut off his head in front of about 50 bystanders in the middle of Amsterdam. Lying dead in the streets, the great-grandnephew of Vincent van Gogh, killed by a Muslim. Well, the dike burst. And across the Netherlands, many mosques were burned or defaced in the aftermath. And what had been known as the most progressive, open, tolerant nation in the world, the Netherlands, right? This is where you can smoke weed back in the 90s, right? The most progressive society. These people are open. This dream of a multicultural society is up in flames. And an intense backlash comes. Mosques all over the country are burned. This is a Muslim school that was attacked. And what comes in is in one of the most profound shifts in Dutch political life. A new political party, a new political movement of right-wing nationalism and populism rose. This is Geert Wilders. I don't know what it is about right-wing nationalists and blonde hair and tangerine skin. But it's a thing. So the politics of high walls rush in. They rush in hard and calls for stiff restrictions on immigration, stiff restrictions on refugee resettlement, intense surveillance of Muslim schools and mosques, Muslim charities and families, laws against burqas are discussed, all kinds of very heightened, intense political rhetoric that would have been unimaginable 10 years earlier. This intense shift happens. So, this is a brutally short story, and you can buy the book if you want a more intense explanation. But there are a number of things from this story that we can deduce and specifically need to name. But first, before we criticize them, let's talk about what they get right. Open Doors, clearly, any sort of Christian ethical response to these kinds of issues has to name that Muslims have rights and dignity, right? This is Christian Ethics 101. We are made in the image of God, right? God loves us. Muslims have rights and dignity, and we will be judged by our God, by how we treat them, right? So Open Doors, absolutely right there. And High Walls are absolutely correct that Muslim immigration presents real challenges, that political life has real limits, and we ought not paper over them or try to suppress them, but actually wrestle with the real challenges of deep, deep difference. In an age of globalization, when difference is coming at us quickly, it's deep, it's close. In Amsterdam, you have Moroccans and Chinese and Americans and Dutch people living on top of each other. This is not a common or easy thing to do. And those on the right are absolutely right that pluralism presents real, deep challenges that we need to pay attention to. However, as I said, Open Doors needs to recognize the deep challenges of difference. They need to not suppress conversation, but welcome conversation. Democracy does not do well when people feel as if they're not allowed to speak. They tended to be very patronizing with Muslim immigrants, so let me help you, poor immigrant. They tended to treat immigrants as passive patients of the state. These are people in need. They don't bring anything of value to the country. They're sort of in need of my help and my tutelage. And ultimately it was unsustainable, simply because it could not cultivate a citizenry that could handle this kind of deep difference. Right? It could only suppress frustration. High walls fails in many, many ways. First is that it's simply too late. You're trying to build walls after you've already brought everyone in. It doesn't actually answer the question of what do we do with the people who are here. It tends to be fear-based. I'm not a historian, but I don't know if we have any historical evidence of thriving political cultures that are based upon fear. It's tough to find. It's intentionally provocative. So there's an argument to be made that Islamic extremism and right-wing nationalism feed one another and depend upon one another in important ways. And then finally, once again, it's unsustainable. You cannot continue a political culture over the long term based upon fear and walls. Wall language can't help you devise a way to live together. Ultimately, what I'm going to argue is that this is a conversation about houses, right? Walls and doors. Think about the metaphor. If I were to ask you what makes your house a home, no one here would talk about, oh, I have these amazing walls. They're so great at keeping people out, right? Or my favorite thing is that my door is open all the time. No, you wouldn't. You would talk about something else. And I'm going to get to that something else here in a little bit. And here we come to Christian ethics. There are many problems, sort of practical problems that I listed here. But the biggest problem is really this. Christians, by and large in Europe, and now increasingly in the United States, are following the language of open doors and high walls. Christ really isn't a part of Christian political rhetoric on these things. If he is, it's sort of a sprinkling at the end. The church in America and the church in Europe largely simply accept the political arguments of open doors or high walls on their own. And they don't actually begin with the person of Jesus Christ. And as a Christian ethicist, if I say anything, it's this. Christian ethics should have something to do with Christ. So, an alternative framework based upon the person of Christ. To do that, I want to tell a quick story. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, as I said, there were many mosques being burned in the Netherlands. One night, in a village just north of Amsterdam, a conservative Pentecostal pastor got up and he walked down to his local mosque and he knocked on the door. And inside were a number of understandably frightened Muslims. You see a white Dutchman at the door in the night. And with an intensity in his voice, he says, "I'm here to guard your mosque. And I have called all of my pastor friends in this province, and we're going to guard every mosque in this province until this stops." And they did. And none of those mosques were attacked, because every single night they had a Christian pastor and parts of their congregations marching around these mosques. Now, when I heard of this story, I wanted to meet this guy. And he had me over for coffee and cake, like you do. And, of course, you know what my question was. As a Christian ethicist, why did you do this? What made you do this? And he started off by saying, now let me be clear with you. I don't like Muslims. What? So I don't like them. I don't like the God they worship. Said, I don't like how they're changing my country. I think they cause a lot of trouble in our cities. I'd prefer they go. I was like, This is an odd way to start your story of why you did this, but so I settled back into my chair. So, but why did you do this? And he said, Christ made me do it. I didn't want to. Now, if I had a relationship with this man, we would have a lot of conversations about his perspectives on his life, right? But there's something profound in that story that I want to grab onto that I think is really particularly important for the church here in America. Wherever we start, we have to start somewhere with people in these conversations. And for him, it was the witness of Christ, a third actor, invading into his life and demanding that he go against his emotions and his story. And so that is what I want to explore. Christ's table politics. Because what I want to argue is that a Christian understanding of politics is going to see the final end of politics, the final purpose, is not walls and it's not doors, it's the table. But the real purpose of a home is not, it doesn't end with security or openness, but actual community and relationship. And ultimately, the ultimate purpose of the Christian faith is relationship. So if we're going to write an alternative story, an alternative Christian political response to this, I want to start by thinking about Christ's kingship over all of these things, because ultimately, the issue of Muslim immigration is one of fear for many Christians in Europe and here in the United States. And our ultimate resource for responding to fear is the kingship of Christ, the sovereignty of Christ. That if Christ is in control, then fear is not an option for me. That can't be a part of my vocabulary. So I draw upon a number of Dutch theologians, and it's not important their names. Many of you, I'm sure, are not dying to get into Dutch theology, but I would love it if you would. But there's a man named Abraham Kuyper who argued that religious freedom is critically important. And it's critically important because Christ alone is king, not Christians. That was his fundamental beginning for all political theology. That Christ is king, not Christians. Christ is king over the nations. And he's king in a number of different ways. And one of them is temporally, in terms of the future of the nation. A lot of issues with pluralism and religious freedom have to do with an anxiety about where the country is going, right? A desire to take the country back, or to protect our future, to steer it in the way that we want it to go. And what Kuyper said is absolutely critical is that we recognize that Christ alone is sovereign over time, not Christians. Christ alone is sovereign over time. And so if Christians try to control history, they are taking Christ's throne from him. They're taking something that is not theirs. Furthermore, he argues that Christ is a spatial king. What does that mean? That means that Christ is king over the different spaces in the nation. He's king over every social community and institution, not Christians. What does that mean for this issue of Muslim immigration? Well, as I said, there are all of these debates over what do we do about surveilling mosques and making sure they're not getting radicalized, or surveilling Muslim schools, or invading Muslim families. How do we politically invade these Muslim spaces and make them like us? Abraham Kuyper's argument is that Christ alone is king over these spaces, and a Christian ought never to invade those sacred spaces and declare themselves king over these spaces. Christ alone has that role. Okay? So that kingship creates this critical political space in which the Christian has a hands-off mentality. So it is from these two that Piper develops a very robust argument for rich religious freedom and generous public space for different faiths. But let's look at another aspect of Christ worship. I want to turn specifically to Holy Week, because I think in Holy Week we find some really important markers as to how Christians should respond to Muslim immigrants. The first is we get a picture of what it means to be a healing king. On the Mount of Olives, as he's being arrested, people come with clubs and swords and torches. There's a great deal of shouting. It's dark. You remember the story. And all of the disciples what do they want to do? They want to fight, right? Or run away. They're terrified. They're gripped by fear. And in the maelstrom, one disciple cuts off the ear of a slave. And what does Jesus do? The Lion of David, King Jesus, reaches down amidst the chaos, picks up the ear, and heals the person who's come to find him. Now, I don't believe that Muslims are going to take over Europe or the United States. I think there's piles of sociological evidence to say that Sharia is not right around the corner here in Valparaiso, Indiana. And I will sit and argue with Christians about this at length. But simply to say that this story embodies Christ's response to difference, threatening difference, and fear in a way that we as Christians must wrestle with. Here he heals, calm, nonviolent way, someone who has come to arrest him. Another Dutch theologian provides a profound reflection on the crucifixion of Christ, and specifically the nakedness of Jesus on the cross. I don't know how many of you have pondered the fact that Jesus was naked on the cross, but this particular theologian thinks that it's a critical thing that we need to consider. That the first thing that God does for us when we leave the Garden of Eden is he clothes us. And the last thing that we do to our God before we kill him is we take his clothes from him. This particular theologian, Klaus Gilder, argues that on the cross, we did not expose Jesus, but Jesus exposed us. That we are forced to look at ourselves and look at what we've done and consider how we have participated. What does that have to do with Muslim immigration? One of the things that the West really loves to do to Muslims is dress them up. Dress them up as a security threat. Dress them up as dangerous. Dress them up as backwards, as ideologues. Dress them up in all kinds of things. Dress them up as other. Right? If we can dress them up in something that we can understand, we can control them, we can marginalize them, we can demonize them, we can do whatever we want to them. But what happens for the Christian who beholds the naked Savior and has to look at themselves and recognize that on the cross, I was disrobed. And any violence that I might see in my Muslim neighbor is also present in me. I have to admit that. And thus, coming away from the cross, the Christian enters into a relationship with a Muslim sister or brother with a sense of profound humility. Profound humility. Not that I can dress them up as something other than me, but that any struggle that I might find in them, I can find in myself as well. Finally, a hospitable king. In Holy Week, we see demonstrations of Christ's hospitality profound hospitality, not simply to Christ's friends, but to those who would attack him. Christ does not paper over the difficulties of hospitality, does not romanticize that hospitality, right? In no way does it look easy to follow Jesus, right? Real blood is spilled with this kind of love. And ultimately, through all the struggle, what is demonstrated in Holy Week is that the ultimate purpose is a meal, right? It begins with a meal with his friends, and it ends with a meal at the beach. Christ is about hospitality. The cross is not an end in itself. Its purpose is reconciliation. And so here in these moments, I can only give you moments, but we get windows into a table politics for the Christian life that is quite different than simply seeking security or generosity from a distance. We have an intimate, costly hospitality on display for us. So I wanted to talk with you just a few ways we can get started, a few things that we can do. There are a number of organizations that I just wanted to point you to. We're going to get to some time of Q&A. World Relief is doing tremendous work in terms of refugee resettlement. I believe there's a Lutheran Services that does tremendous work as well. It's profoundly fascinating that as dark a record as Christians have here in the United States around refugees and immigrants, some of the best refugee resettlement organizations come from the church, and World Relief is one of them. I serve for the Center for Public Justice in Washington, D.C., which one of the things I found in my explorations of religious freedom is that Christians are profoundly good at defending their own religious freedom, but we struggle to defend others' religious freedom. And my message to you on this subject is that defending your own religious freedom is a good thing. It's a good thing. But defending the religious freedom of another faith is a grace thing for Christians. And the Center for Public Justice is one of those unique Christian organizations that is about defending the religious freedom of all people. And they do so in a really generous way. And for those of you who are undergraduates and you're interested in political ethics or getting started writing about faith and politics, they have a blog for undergraduates called Shared Justice. And they specifically publish undergraduate students on issues of faith and justice. And so I encourage you to get connected with them. I'm at Fuller Seminary, and we have an Islamic Studies program that's profoundly wonderful. I myself am not a scholar of Islam, as you can tell. I'm focused specifically on helping Christians respond well to Muslims. We have a number of great scholars there. And there's me over there. That's not important. But profoundly, the most important thing here is that hospitality is something that we practice. And anything that we practice, we're going to start off being bad at. And I want to tell you a story, just in closing.
You're doing great.
You're doing good? Okay, good. I'll tell you a story about being bad at hospitality. I've got a couple stories about being bad at hospitality. One, I met a very eager church planter. Church planters are eager. I met a very eager one in Amsterdam. He wanted to go into this heavily diverse neighborhood in Amsterdam and plant a church. And the neighborhood itself was about 40% Muslim, but I think about 80% not white Dutch. People from all over the globe. And his idea was, I'm going to start hosting these meals for all of these immigrants. And I'm going to be generous, I'm going to host these meals, and they're all going to come, and then I'm going to start this church, and they're just going to love me. It didn't go very well. Nobody came to his meals. And there were a number of reasons for that, but one of them was particularly that these people were tired of being treated like patients, tired of being treated like they were people in need who had nothing to offer. And he was becoming more and more discouraged that these things weren't working. And near giving up, he walks down the hallway of his apartment building and knocks on his neighbor's door and asks her to make a meal for him. I believe she came from Somalia, and she was honored by the request. And over the meal, he asked her about the meal. And she told him about her mother and her grandmother and how they cooked this meal. Told him all about her homeland. They talked about her story. And it was there over that table that he recognized the humanizing opportunity to be a guest and a host. And he started to go around asking for meals as a Dutch person. You see, Dutch people love to serve, are very uncomfortable being guests. And over time, he started to develop a collective meal where people from Suriname and Kenya and Ethiopia and Iraq and Afghanistan and Morocco would come together and they would take turns. And someone would make a meal for everyone from their country. And they would have an opportunity to share the story of their family and their special food. And be humanized for a moment. For a moment, they were not a person in need, but they were a person hosted. And developed a community called Oaza there. That's a profoundly beautiful community in a neighborhood that is rife with interethnic tension. A second story. I met a group of women who like to sew in Rotterdam. This is another city in the Netherlands that has been torn apart by tension between Dutch and Muslim immigrants. A couple of Christians got this idea that we need to do interfaith dialogue in Rotterdam as a response to this tension. And they asked a group of Christian women to go in and start a Muslim-Christian dialogue in one particular neighborhood. And it failed spectacularly for a number of reasons. One, neither the Christian women nor the Muslim women were particularly interested in theology. Neither of them really wanted to talk about theology, and particularly the Muslim women weren't terribly skilled in the Dutch language, and theological Dutch it's tough. So they didn't find it very inspiring, and slowly over time, the conversation started to die out. And as it started to die out, one of the Christian women got this idea, or discovered that some of the other Muslim women like to sew. And so they started to say, hey, let's throw off this dialogue thing, and let's just sew together. And so week after week, they started to sew together. And the nice thing about sewing, I've been told I'm terrible at it. The nice thing about sewing is if you're hanging out with other people sewing, and you don't have anything to talk about, you can just sew. Like, it's okay to be quiet for a while. And you can just work with your hands, and if there's a tense moment or just sort of a miscommunication, like you just focus on your pillow or whatever you're working with. But over time, they regularly came together to sew. And they started to talk with one another. Just talk about their kids, about their husbands, talk about their city. They started to talk about their frustrations, their common frustrations with Dutch culture, about the materialism, about the sexism, the way in which women are sexualized in Dutch culture. The Muslim women started to recognize that there's actually a difference between Dutch Christians and Dutch secular people. You see, when the Muslim women come to the Netherlands, they see marijuana and prostitution and greed and materialism, and they see that all as Christian. That's what Christians are, that's what Christians do. And over these conversations, they start to find deep, deep sense of commonness, a concern for the raising of their children in the faith, a concern for women's dignity and rights, a concern for these prostitutes. And they start to care for one another. They start to visit each other when they're sick, make meals for one another. They start to build these bonds. Theology comes up from time to time, but the purpose is the relationship, right? The hospitality. And in speaking with these Christian women, I had the opportunity to talk with them. They used the parable of the sower to describe what they were doing. And they said that we don't sow the seeds. We're just trying to take care of the soil, to remove some stones from their soil. We're not in the business of saving anybody. We're responsible for being hospitable to these women. And we're going to have to answer for how we cared for them and for our relationships with them. And so hospitality is something that all of us have an opportunity to demonstrate. Just last night, I was at home, and my son, we're trying to do play dates now, so I got an 8-year-old, and trying to do play dates, which ultimately means their parents come over too. And it just so happened that these parents came over last night, were Jewish. And my wife and I had an opportunity to just ask them how they're doing. And give them space while the kids are playing to talk about how they're doing in the wake of this week. All of us encounter difference. It might not be a Muslim in our neighborhood, but we encounter sexual difference, racial difference, religious difference, economic difference every single day. And the critical thing is this. For those of us who have experienced the hospitality of the cross, to not go, to fail to demonstrate hospitality to others is to deny the cross that made space for you, that was hospitable for you. But these things are deeply linked. That Christ makes space for us so that we might make space for others. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Kaemingk. If you do need to go, just so that everybody knows, the book is for sale here in the back. The bookstore is kind of running that for us. So there's a table out there. But we have about 10 minutes.
Yes, ma'am.
You talked a little bit about dialogues between Muslim women and Christian women, but would it be fair to say that the expectations of Muslim women and men differ as to what religious freedom and rights look like when they're coming into this country? And if so, how does the Christian ethicist approach that conversation in a way that's hospitable to all sides?
Can you be more explicit about what you mean?
Van Gogh presented a very extreme example of sort of gender roles that exist. And I don't think they're unique to the Islamic culture. I think they're a pattern of societies that have a large agrarian and self-providing base, but that's besides the point. When these people are coming from those societies where there might be stronger enforced gender roles, are there expectations differing between the men and women as they're coming into these European and American countries?
Yeah. So Islam is a global religion, which is extremely complex. And that's why we have Islamic studies faculty members. But it's extremely complex, just like Christianity in terms of gender roles. So I can find you churches that have very different perspectives on gender roles, just like I can find you mosques the same. And yeah, that's a real challenge. But to be cognizant of the fact that Islam is a deeply diverse faith with a lot of internal battles and debates over specific gender roles. Am I getting at what you're talking about here? I want to make sure.
I guess what I'm asking is, as these immigrants are coming in, are the women and men expecting different things from religious freedom and rights as they're entering the country?
we ask a lot of questions and we listen. Yes, sir, in the back.
About 20 years ago, the Swedish and Norwegian experience on this issue was getting pretty complicated as well. And in little villages in Sweden, a person was established to manage this question. So every town had, quote, a diversity person to try to think through how to deal with the difficulties that were starting to emerge in Scandinavia.
Go ahead.
They chose not to go with the kingly language. And of course, coming from Lutheran tradition, it would be a different perspective.
Sure.
Also, the monarchy in Scandinavia was not looked at favorably, particularly when an issue of Sharia law was coming into play, which is where it's played itself out in the politics in Scandinavia significantly. So in other words, who has jurisdiction over legal problems as they play themselves out in autonomous bodies within the country?
Yep.
The direction they went was with the suffering Christ. So it's theologically a different position than you're taking.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how you reconcile currently the kingly language and supremacy, which is the risk in Christian dialogue.
It's a great question. So how I deal with that is I think we need Christ's cross and Christ's crown for these kinds of discussions, because and you would be in bad shape if you only went with one or the other. Now let me explain. If it was only Christ's cross, you couldn't talk about issues of power. And one of the critical issues when it comes to religious freedom and religious diversity is power. You have to take that very, very seriously. So any sort of political philosophy has to answer the question of sovereignty. Who is ultimately sovereign? And that is why I make that distinction between Christ is king, not Christians. That actually the lordship of Christ is distinct from the Christian faith. And so there's sort of a hands-off quality to the mosque or the Muslim family, because Christ alone sits in judgment there. However, the suffering Christ offers us this understanding that Christian political life is not simply ordering laws and sovereignties, but actually engaging in a very difficult and hurting world with arms open. And so we need both of those things, and a Christology that rests simply with the cross or with the crown is going to get us into trouble. So that's why I have this whole chapter specifically on Christology and our Muslim neighbors, because what we find in Christ, well, first of all, as I've said, Muslim immigration is a tremendously complex debate. It is overwhelming in its complexity, and as you weed into these issues, you immediately feel overwhelmed and inadequate to respond to all of these different questions and issues. And so what we need is a moral model that is equally complex. And Christ himself is a king, a prophet, a servant, a friend, a healer, a doctor, Emmanuel. We have sort of a complex Christ to follow into this very complex and difficult situation. It doesn't paper over the difficulties of it. And that's what gives me hope in this. Yes, sir.
I'm trying to kind of create a Christian forum to have a discussion with the Muslims, but from what I can remember, the Dutch population is a substantial amount that aren't Christians.
Yes.
And in the kind of example you gave of the sowers, the Muslims, the Christians that are talking about, are kind of complaining about like a secular part of society. Are you concerned that you're kind of leaving out a substantial portion of the population from the discussion with your kind of solution?
Right. So I'm a Christian theologian and a Christian ethicist, so I'm trying to help Christians wrestle with this issue. Secular people, or secular political philosophers, are struggling with these issues as well. And what's really fascinating is to watch secular political philosophers try to find language for hospitality. They're struggling in Europe in very profound ways with, you have a large population in Europe that has just decided we don't like Muslims. We don't want them here. We have no patience for them. We don't want them here. And how do you, as a secular government, cultivate affection without moral language? So Europe, for 1,000 years, could draw on Christian language to talk about these kinds of things, but if it doesn't have that, that's a difficulty. But I would say that the Christian, I'm focused on helping Christians think about this issue, and we've got enough troubles in our own tribe about loving people who are different that I'm gonna focus on my people. Yes, ma'am.
I have more of a statement of the Muslim countries that we visited.
Yeah.
Hospitality is amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, you found that too.
Absolutely.
They just want to feed you, and do you like their food? You're giving them more. They want to get more.
So it's throughout the Quran as well. So there's a book called Hospitality and Islam by a professor in Edinburgh named Mona Siddiqui, Pakistani, and she's tremendous. But she specifically looks throughout the Quran at the theme of hospitality. It's very. Okay, I'm actually going to take. Yes, Professor, I'll do yours, and then I'll have one closing thought for us.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm curious, just in Brazil, a far-right government, state of power,
Yeah.
and, we're seeing this around the world,
Yeah.
and here at home, in the last, in around this midterm election, this caravan has become a big part of the news, and, the president's saying there's unknown Middle Easterners in this caravan.
Yes.
And my sense is that rhetoric is resonating with a lot of Christians in our neighborhoods and in our country. And I wonder, why do you think Christians are afraid right now? And why is it that, what is it that we're afraid of? And what do you recommend? Here in Valparaiso, there are a lot of people who are afraid of Muslims. And I know them. How do we talk about this without retreating into the people that I already know agree with me?
Yeah, thank you. There's a number of ways of going about this. As an academic, of course, I want to prescribe books and articles and things to read. Like my book. But I have to tell you that I think books and learning are actually down the list of the first things I would do, and that is actually bringing people together for meals and conversation. Is the absolute first thing I would do. Because real human beings right in front of you, tearing bread open and eating it, is the best way to tear down these technological walls that we make through social media and cable news, and all the different ways in which we dress people up who are not in our tribe. And so it's that personal experience, it's hearing those stories, and getting to know those people. It's profound. And then the second, for Christians, so I teach at an evangelical seminary. And evangelicals have gotten a lot of press lately in a lot of bad ways. And so I have to speak with my fellow evangelicals about this issue. And I'll just tell you that my strategy is to call them specifically on Christ. And to say, look, is Jesus Lord or isn't he? Because if Jesus is Lord, then you can't act so afraid. Because if you are living by fear, you are denying the lordship of Christ. So it's straight calling them on that, because an evangelical is not going to want to waver on Christ's lordship. Right? You can do that. You can call them on that. And then simply to say once again, like, Jesus made space for you. If you don't make space for others, you're spitting on that cross that made space for you. Absolutely hard. And saying it that hard and that straight is. I want to close with one last thing, and it's on top of ideas and on top of practice, it's the power of worship. I just walked through your chapel, which is just incredible. I'm going to tell the story of this church in London that wanted to demonstrate the relevance of Christmas and connect it to contemporary events and remind its people that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were refugees. And they commissioned an artist to do something to help them remember that their Lord was a refugee. And the artist decided to go down to Greece and collect clothes from children, from refugees who had washed ashore in Greece, life preservers, blankets, coats, jackets, t-shirts from refugees. And the artist suspended all of this clothing above the congregation so that while they were remembering the nativity story, they were remembering their Lord, hanging over them is this reminder of what's going on in the world. Now, if you can imagine, of course, I could give a whole theological argument to these people, but simply imagine being in this sanctuary and having to sing a song like, "And they will know we are Christians by our love," with this hanging over you, right? My main message when I go to speak to Christians on this is that Muslim immigration represents a profound, not a profound challenge to the church, but a profound opportunity for the church to remember what it is to follow Jesus. And that is, I hope, what your takeaway is today. Thank you for having me.